This lecture will focus on how the government actually worked that we had just written down into this Constitution. So now that the Constitution had been ratified, the original government, the original people in charge, had to take this government that had been written down and turn it into an actual functioning real world government. And so the man that they selected to do that, that was elected to be the first president of the United States, was George Washington. And he was a unanimous selection. If you don't remember, unanimous, that word means everybody was or voted for him. So it was 100% unanimous selection from the Electoral College to pick George Washington to be the first president. And like I said, he had to take those words and turn them into an actual government. So he started off by creating a bureaucracy, creating people that could do parts of his work for him, because he knew that as president, he would not be able to do absolutely everything. And so he created 4 departments. Okay, he created the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of War, and the Office of the Attorney General. Now, the question of what did these departments do? The Department of State mostly handled affairs with other countries. So if you needed to make treaties or make peace or talk about trade or anything like that, that's your department that you're dealing with. And that was headed, or the person to head it was selected, was Thomas Jefferson. Okay. The Department of Treasury handled anything to do with money, and so this was all about making money for the government as well as managing the money so that people could be happy. And this was Alexander Hamilton that was put in charge of that. And then he was the Secretary of Treasury. And then the Department of War was just handling anything that dealt with going to war or defending the country. And that was General Henry Knox that was put in charge of that, longtime general and friend of George Washington. And then the Office of the Attorney General handled any kind of legal issues that the government had to deal with as an entity. And that was Edmund Randolph who was put in charge of that. These men together, these 4 men, created what was called the first cabinet. We still call it a cabinet today, but what a cabinet is just a group of advisors to the president, and they meet regularly. They meet all the time to give their advice on different things that are happening within their own little realm. Okay, and so all of these men get together, and 5 minds is better than 1, and they try and handle the issues of the United States. Another thing that Washington set up with his bureaucracy was under the Judiciary Act of 1789. He had to create the court system. And so he created 13 federal district courts and 3 court of appeals. And then, of course, the Supreme Court that was already in the Constitution that needed to be created. And he appointed the first federal judges. Of course, those federal judges, because of checks and balances, had to be approved by the Congress, but he appointed them, and he appointed John Jay as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, so kind of the top judge in the land. The first and biggest concern that the government has was to make money. They needed money to function. That's why the Articles of Confederation failed. They didn't have any good, sustainable way of making and dealing with money. And so we needed this money to pay back the debts from our wars, okay, that we had just done, the Revolutionary War, right? We owed a lot of money, and just to function as a government. And so there were 2 kind of major plans that were talked about at this time. James Madison was a leader in the Congress, so he was kind of one of them that was kind of pushing a plan, and then Alexander Hamilton was the other one here. Okay, and so Madison's plan was, how are we going to make money? We need to charge other countries for it. And so he set up the Tariff Act of 1789. The Tariff Act of 1789 was just those tariffs that we've already talked about before and why you need those. They were just taxes that were set on certain imported items, so that you could make some money off of charging other countries to sell their goods in our country. All right. And so that was James Madison's main plan to make money. But Alexander Hamilton said, yes, I agree. We need to do that. He was on board with that part of the plan. But he said, we also need more money than that. We need to have access to more money. And so he said we also need to be able as a government to borrow money, right? But there was a problem with borrowing money. The government, or I guess the Continental Army at that time, had already borrowed a whole lot of money, and the Articles of Confederation government had also borrowed a bunch of money. They had issued over $50 million in bonds, and at that point $50 million was a lot of money, right? They had issued all of these bonds out, and bonds are just a paper note, just a piece of paper that promise that the government will pay back that money with interest after a period of time. So after 5 years, I'll pay you back, all the money that you lent me, plus I'll pay you interest on it. And what Alexander Hamilton said is we need to pay back all 50 million of these bonds and all of these war debts and everything else. We need to pay all of it back so that people are confident lending to us in the future. Because if you have a bond and you never get that money back from the government, then you're never going to borrow money. You're never going to buy another bond. You're never going to do that again because you just gave your money away. So he said, we really need this confidence in us that we are going to pay back in order to ever be able to borrow money in the future. So the people that were against Hamilton's plan were kind of led by that James Madison, who thought that we could make enough money just off of the tariffs. And what he said is if we pay back all of this debt, then pay back all of these bonds that the Articles of Confederation had promised, that would be super unfair to the people that bought the bonds. Now this doesn't make sense, right? We pay them back. How is that going to be unfair to them? Well, what happened is those people, a lot of people from the South, were afraid they'd never get their money back when the Articles of Confederation government started to fail. And so they sold their bonds. They sold that piece of paper that was worth the money plus the interest, right? A piece of paper like that. And they sold them for just a little bit of money so they could get some of that money back to speculators. And speculators are just people who risk money, so they're risking money by buying this thing that might be worth $0 in hopes that if it gets paid back, they make a whole lot of money, so hoping they get a financial profit. And most of these speculators were from the North, and so they said this is benefiting those speculators, and it's super unfair to the regular people who you borrowed money from. But honestly, they chose to sell it, so I don't know what I think about that. But anyways, state debts, they also said that state debts shouldn't be paid off. If the state made this deal, the federal government shouldn't pay them all off. And the reason that they kind of said this is because a lot of the southern states had already paid most of their war debt off. And so it was really the northern states that had the debt that was going to be paid. And so they said, why should we be paying taxes into this government, and this government is paying for the debts of some other state, We took care of our business. Why do we have to pay to take care of other people's? And so it kind of shows you back before it was just a bunch of little states stuck together in this confederation. Now we're trying to get this federal government who takes care of the entire country. We think of ourselves as one instead of a bunch of little states. It was debated for many, many months, and a compromise was eventually reached. The Southerners said, we will vote for Hamilton's plan, but to make sure that you guys are going to respect what's happening in the South, we want the capital of the United States to be moved into the South, into an area on the Potomac River that we would call the District of Columbia. So that's Washington, D.C., the capital that we have today. It didn't move at this time, but it was an agreement that it would be moved there soon. Take a moment to write the answer to this question. And the next thing that happened is Hamilton said, we really need to make a bank, a national bank, the Bank of the United States. That's what we need to happen. Okay, and so Hamilton went to Congress and said, really, we need to create a national bank. And this national bank can do two things. It can manage our nation's debts. It can take care of that, control that, make sure everything's under control. And it can also issue paper money, which is pretty important. They wanted to issue a paper money that was just one money for the entire country of the United States of America. Instead of having South Carolina money and Delaware money and Virginia money, and every time you go across the borders, you have to switch it out, and that's just kind of a pain. And so they wanted this paper money that was just for the whole country, so that Anybody could trade with anybody within this country, and that would help the economy grow. Now, the Southerners were not happy about this idea of making the Bank the United States, because the Southerners were all about the states' rights. And they said the government can't take more rights. They can't just do this because it isn't one of the enumerated powers. And enumerated powers is just a big fancy word for saying the powers that are actually written down, that are actually listed in the Constitution as belonging to the federal government. So if it doesn't say you can do this, then you can't do this. But Alexander Hamilton said, wait a minute. Let's look real quick at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which says that we can make any laws that are necessary and proper to execute our responsibilities. So if it is necessary and proper, then we can make that law even if it doesn't say, or take that power even if it doesn't say we're actually allowed to take that power. And so that made kind of this whole new idea of implied powers. Okay, this necessary and proper clause created implied powers, which are powers that are not listed in the Constitution, but that the federal government claims so that they can do the things that they are supposed to do. And so in 1791, as an implied power, the Bank of the United States was created and given a 20-year charter. Hamilton also believed that the government had the right to impose taxes over the entire country. And so one of these taxes that he imposed, or they imposed, started the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1791, Congress created a tax, an excise tax on making whiskey. They said, if you're going to make whiskey out of your grain, then you have to pay this tax to the government on all of it that you sell. And so this made, obviously, the farmers who took their grain and distilled whiskey with it and sold it, that made them very, very mad. And so in 1794, a group of Western Pennsylvania farmers got together and started a rebellion. They went around terrorizing tax collectors, stopping court proceedings, robbing people from the mail, just taking money and items out of the mail. Okay, and Washington said, we can't let this stand. And so he himself put on his military, the president of the United States put on his military uniform and led 13,000 troops out to crush the rebellion. By the time he got out there, the Western Pennsylvania farmers had already dispersed without a fight, because they knew that this big force of troops were headed their way. So from these arguments over Alexander Hamilton's financial program, the first political parties were born, and the people in Congress were divided. All right, and so we already have these partisan politics, these two groups that are against each other. All right, one of those groups was the Federalists. We've heard that before, but now it's a political party. The Federalists do not exist in any capacity today. Okay, this is a political party that kind of went away. All right, and this was kind of embodied by, not led by, but embodied by Alexander Hamilton and his arguments. And a lot of the arguments were they needed a strong federal government, especially to start the country. They knew the Articles of Confederation had failed, and they needed that main government to have some power. And they said also believed that democracy is kind of dangerous to freedom, dangerous to liberty. You need to put the government in the hands of the rich, the well-born, the able, the educated, all that kind of stuff, so that they can make good decisions for us. So it shouldn't just be this thing where it's mob mentality and that kind of stuff. We don't want that, because it'll end up bad. And then the other thing is the policies that they had. Most of their policies supported manufacturing, so factories and stuff like that, making stuff, and then trade with other people. And so that's what the way they thought that the economy would be most healthy is if we help those people out. The Democratic Republicans, also known as the Democrats today, okay, back then they were called Republicans. It's super confusing. Okay, most people called them Republicans, but they have morphed into what the Democrats are today. They were led by Thomas Jefferson. They believed that independent farmers were really the strength of America, that if you have land and you have your own little farm and you need it to survive, you will fight to preserve it. You will fight to keep the government going on. And so, of course, they supported farming over that manufacturing and trade. That was most of their policies supported farming. They kind of thought that if you have the rich in charge and those people are in charge, they're going to corrupt the government. They're going to take away freedom from the people. The people should have more say. And they also said that if you have that happening, there's going to be this divide between the rich and the poor, and they're going to start to hate each other and have animosity if we have only the rich people in charge of us. So that's kind of the startup of the brand new political parties. Take a moment to write out the answer to this question. So these political parties not only divided Congress, but they also divided the people of America, and they divided them kind of by region. And you can see it on this electoral map from 1796. You can see the Democratic Republicans, remember they're called the Republicans back then, they're seen mostly in the rural areas, the South and the West. So these green states are the ones that voted Democratic Republican. And then the Federalists were more of this urban area, the northern area. So those kind of pink, red, whatever you want to call them, states are the states that voted Federalist. So you can kind of see the divide in the map right there. The brown were not states yet, so they weren't voting yet. Those were territories. And so, again, this fight, this division, this argument began about financial policies, and Alexander Hamilton kind of started this argument that we needed to have at the beginning of our country. But some things started to happen over in Europe that we're going to talk about in the next lecture that made things even get worse and the people to get more divided and more angry at each other. Take some time to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, create 3 test questions, the things that you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.